she was mocked, shunned for being a divorced mother. The world turned its back on her. Yet fate had other plans. For when the king's perfect princess stood tall, the rich duke looked past her crown and chose the woman no one believed was worthy. The morning mist clung to Hyde Park with the tenacity of the gossip that followed Isidora wherever she walked. It was a soft grey shroud that blurred the edges of the grand elms and dampened the sounds of the city awakening, yet it offered no concealment from the sharp, judging eyes of the Ton. Each step she took along the gravel path felt measured, a conscious effort to project a calm she did not feel. Behind her, the innocent, gleeful shouts of her two children chasing a hoop were a stark contrast to the silence that fell in her wake. A silence punctuated by the rustle of silk and the hissed whispers that were meant to be heard. A lady in a peacock blue walking dress averted her gaze so pointedly it was more an accusation than a snub. Two gentlemen tipped their hats with a mocking deference that made her cheeks burn. Isidora kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the serene expanse of the Serpentine ahead, but inside the familiar ache of shame bloomed anew. It was a constant companion, this shame, a heavy cloak she had been forced to wear since the day her marriage had dissolved into public spectacle. She was no longer Mrs. Isidora Granville, a respected wife. She was simply Isidora, the divorced woman, a walking scandal. Her mind drifted back to the gilded cage of her former life. The marriage had been one of convenience, arranged by families with more interest in merging fortunes than fostering affection. Her husband, Arthur, had been a man of cold ambition and warmer temper, his charm reserved for the outside world. Behind closed doors, his indifference had been a slow, chilling poison. The final rupture had not been explosive, but a quiet, humiliating unraveling played out in drawing rooms and lawyers' offices. He had wanted his freedom for a newer, younger model, and she had been the inconvenient obstacle. In obtaining his freedom, he had ensured hers came at the cost of her reputation. A burst of laughter from her son, Charles, as he tumbled onto the grass, pulled her from the bitter reverie. She watched as her daughter, Lily, rushed to help him, her small face creased with concern. Their innocence was her anchor, the pure, uncomplicated love they offered, the one thing society could not tarnish. For them, she endured the walks in the park, the pointed silences, the cruel epithets muttered behind fluttering fans. She would face 1,000 cutting whispers if it meant her children could have this hour of sunshine and open air. She found an empty bench near the water's edge, the cold of the iron seeping through her skirts. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire scene, the children at play, the fashionable parade of the elite, and the invisible walls that separated her from them. Her resilience was a carefully constructed fortress. Each slight, each whisper, was another stone added to its walls. She had learned to school her features into a mask of placid indifference, to let the insults wash over her without a visible flinch. But within the fortress, a weary soul longed for a respite, for a single glance that held not judgment, but simple, human kindness. The sun began to burn through the mist, casting long, distorted shadows. The park grew busier, the whispers louder, more brazen. Isidora rose, calling to her children. As she took their small, sticky hands in hers, she felt the weight of 100 eyes upon her back. But she also felt the firm grip of Charles's hand and the trusting lean of Lily against her side. Straightening her shoulders, she turned from the glittering water and walked back into the heart of the whispering crowd. A solitary figure of grace navigating a sea of condemnation. Her head held high not in defiance, but in survival. London greeted Richard, the Duke of Blackhurst, with the same cacophony of soot and self-importance he had come to despise. His carriage rattled over the cobblestones of Mayfair, the sound a dull percussion beneath the shrill cries of street vendors and the clatter of 100 other conveyances. He leaned back against the velvet squabs, watching the fashionable world stream past his window. A blur of bright waistcoats, elaborate bonnets, and faces etched with the vacant preoccupation of the season. It was a spectacle of exquisite triviality, a marathon of vanity he was obligated to run once more. The weight of his title felt heavier here in the city, a mantle of expectation woven from threads of duty, lineage, and the incessant demand to conform. His own townhouse, a stark, imposing edifice in Grosvenor Square, offered little solace. It was a monument to his ancestry, filled with the stern portraits of previous dukes whose painted eyes seemed to follow him with silent disapproval. The silence within was a vacuum soon to be filled with invitations, callers, and the relentless machinery of matchmaking. He had barely shed his travelling cloak before a silver salver piled high with cards was presented to him. He flicked through them with a gloved hand, his mouth a thin line. Soirees, musicales, balls, the same endless rotation of events designed to display eligible daughters like prize heifers at a county fair. He felt a familiar weariness settle in his bones, a profound disconnection from the glittering farce unfolding outside his windows. Seeking a different kind of silence, he retreated to his club. The atmosphere at White's was thick with cigar smoke and the low rumble of masculine conversation. Here, amidst the leather armchairs and the sombre portraits of prime ministers, he hoped to find a respite from the frivolity. He took a seat in a secluded corner, ordering a brandy that he had no real desire to drink. The amber liquid caught the light from the fireplace, and he stared into its depths as if searching for answers it could not possibly hold. He was a man in his prime, wealthy, titled, and yet he felt a yawning emptiness, a craving for something genuine in a world constructed of artifice. It was then that the gossip reached him, drifting over from a nearby group of gentlemen whose loud confidence betrayed their lack of substance. The words Granville and divorce snagged his attention, then a name uttered with a particular blend of scorn and prurient interest. Isidora. He did not turn, did not give any indication he was listening, but his entire focus narrowed to their conversation. They spoke of a woman cast out, a lady walking in Hyde Park with her children, enduring the slings and arrows of the ton with a quiet dignity that seemed to irk them more than any hysterics would have. They dissected her past, her failed marriage, with the cold precision of surgeons operating on a corpse. A spark of something unfamiliar ignited within him. Not pity, but a sharp, undeniable curiosity. While these men clucked their tongues over ruined reputations, his mind conjured an image of the woman they described. He envisioned not a figure of shame, but one of solitary strength. In a society that worshipped perfection and punished deviation, anyone who dared to exist outside its narrow confines was automatically intriguing. His own weariness with the endless parade of flawless, simpering debutantes made the idea of a woman who had already faced society's worst and survived it utterly compelling. He found himself wondering what kind of character could withstand such relentless condemnation, what thoughts lay behind a gaze that met scorn without flinching. The brandy forgotten, Richard sat in his corner. The Duke of Blackhurst, for the first time in a long time, genuinely interested in another soul. The ballroom of Almack's was a gilded cage of light and sound, a symphony of rustling silk, clinking glasses, and the low, constant hum of cultivated conversation. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, their flames reflected endlessly in mirrored walls, creating an illusion of infinite space and infinite scrutiny. For Isidora, standing near a potted fern at the room's periphery, the heat was oppressive, the brilliance of the scene a sharp contrast to the cold shadow in which she stood. She had known it would be like this, a trial by polite society, yet the reality of the exclusion was a physical chill in the warm, perfumed air. She had chosen her gown with deliberate care, a deep sapphire velvet that spoke of quiet dignity rather than desperate fashion. It was a fortress of fabric, and she its lone guardian. The other ladies, resplendent in pastel silks and froths of lace, moved in tight, chattering constellations, their orbits carefully calculated to avoid her gravitational pull. A group would approach, laughter tinkling like fine crystal, only to veer away at the last moment, as if she were a rock in a stream, diverting the current. Their eyes, when they accidentally met hers, were quick and glassy, sliding away to focus on anything else. It was a dance of dismissal more intricate than any minuet, a silent, unanimous agreement to treat her as if she were made of air. Yet Isidora did not wilt. She held her place, her posture erect, her gloved hands clasped loosely before her. She observed the swirling colors, the practiced smiles, the subtle negotiations of status and alliance happening on the dance floor. She was an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe, detached and analytical. The mask of placid indifference she had perfected in Hyde Park was firmly in place, a smooth, unreadable surface that betrayed none of the lonely ache beneath. Each averted gaze, each whispered comment that carried on the edge of hearing, was another stitch in the tapestry of her isolation. But she refused to let the fabric tear. Across the vast expanse of polished floor, near the arched entrance, Richard, the Duke of Blackhurst, surveyed the scene with his customary air of detached boredom. He had been accosted by a succession of ambitious mothers and their blushing daughters, each introduction a variation on the same tedious theme. He offered polite, non-committal responses, his mind elsewhere. His gaze swept over the crowd, a sea of predictable beauty and vacant charm, and his weariness deepened. It was all so tiresomely the same. Then his eyes found the solitary figure in sapphire blue. She was an island of stillness in the churning social sea. He recognized her instantly from the gossip, the description matching the reality with unnerving accuracy. But it was not her scandal that held his attention. It was her profound, unassailable poise. While every other woman in the room seemed desperate to be seen, to be acknowledged, she seemed almost to embrace her invisibility. There was a quiet sovereignty in her stance, a dignity that needed no audience. He watched as a trio of ladies deliberately turned their backs to her, a cruel and calculated snub. He saw the subtle tightening of her jaw, the only sign that the barb had struck home, but her composure did not otherwise break. She simply turned her head, her gaze lifting to observe the dancers, her expression one of thoughtful observation, not self-pity. In that moment, as if sensing the weight of his scrutiny, her eyes shifted from the whirling couples and met his across the crowded room. It was not a bold or flirtatious look, but a direct, unguarded moment of connection. Her eyes, even from a distance, held a depth he had not encountered in all his years in society. They were the color of a twilight sky, and in them he saw not shame, but a weary resilience and intelligence that acknowledged the absurdity of the spectacle surrounding them. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into a dull roar, the figures between them blurring into insignificance. For a handful of heartbeats, the gilded cage fell away, and they were simply two people, isolated in their own ways, recognizing a kindred solitude. Then a passing lord blocked his view, and the moment broke. When the space cleared, she had turned away, once again the picture of serene detachment. But the Duke of Blackhurst remained rooted to the spot. The image of her steady gaze burned into his mind, the carefully constructed walls of his own indifference showing their first, unmistakable crack. The music for the cotillion began, a sprightly, intricate melody that sent a fresh wave of couples flooding onto the dance floor. Isidora remained by the fern, a fixed point in the swirling current of society. She had long since given up any hope of being asked to dance. Her presence here was a statement of endurance, not participation. She watched the young ladies, their faces alight with anticipation as gentlemen bowed before them. Each accepted hand was a confirmation of belonging, a public declaration of worth. For her, there were only polite, averted eyes and the wide, empty space that seemed to naturally form around her. It was a familiar humiliation, one she absorbed into the fortress of her composure, letting it settle deep inside where no one could see. Then, a shift occurred in the atmosphere around her. A subtle tension, a collective intake of breath from those close enough to notice. The crowd seemed to part as if by an unseen force, and through the gap walked the Duke of Blackhurst. His expression was unreadable, his movements deliberate as he crossed the short but significant distance that separated the celebrated from the shunned. He stopped before her, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The vibrant music, the chatter, the hundreds of watching eyes, all faded into a distant hum. He did not smile, but his gaze was direct, serious, holding hers with an intensity that stripped away the layers of pretense surrounding them. He offered a formal bow, deeper than courtesy demanded, a gesture of respect that was itself an act of rebellion. When he straightened, he extended his hand, not with the flourish of a man performing for an audience, but with a simple, undeniable grace. The invitation was silent, yet it echoed through the ballroom louder than any trumpet fanfare. To accept was to defy every unspoken rule, to challenge the very foundation of the society that had ostracized her. For a heartbeat, Isidora hesitated, the fear of the scandal that would surely follow warring with a sudden fierce surge of something she had thought long dead. Defiance. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, even through the layer of her glove, a tangible anchor in the dizzying unreality of the moment. As he led her onto the floor, a ripple of shock spread through the room. The music faltered for a fraction of a second as the musicians themselves registered the unprecedented event. Whispers erupted like a sudden fire, hissing and crackling around the edges of the dance floor. The other dancers stared, their steps becoming stiff and self-conscious, their smiles frozen in place. Then the waltz began. It was a newer, more intimate dance, one that required close contact, and as his hand settled at the small of her back and their other hands joined, the outside world dissolved completely. They moved as one, their steps perfectly in sync, as if they had practiced this moment for a lifetime. He guided her with a confident strength that was both commanding and protective. Isidora, who had held herself so rigidly for so long, felt a tension she had not even been aware of begin to melt away. She was not leading a charge against society. She was simply dancing, her body moving in harmony with his, her gaze locked with his. In his eyes, she saw not curiosity or pity, but a profound understanding, a shared contempt for the petty judgments of the crowd. For the Duke, the sensation was equally jarring. Holding her, he felt none of the bland duty that usually accompanied such interactions. He felt the delicate strength in her frame, saw the flicker of vulnerability she allowed no one else to see, and a fierce protectiveness surged within him. This was not a woman broken by scandal, but one tempered by it, her spirit refined in a fire of public condemnation. As they turned, the faces of the ton blurred into a meaningless mosaic of shock and disapproval. They were no longer the Duke and the scandalous divorcee. They were two souls finding a rare consonance in a world of dissonance. The waltz was their declaration, a silent, graceful revolution set to music. And with every turn, every synchronized step, they danced not for the audience but for themselves, forging a connection that felt more real than anything else in the glittering, gilded room. The final notes of the waltz faded, but the echo of the moment thrummed in Isidora's veins like a second heartbeat. The return to reality was a jarring plunge. The whispers, which had been a distant hum, now swelled into a cacophony of pointed speculation. Every eye in the ballroom felt like a pinprick of judgment, and the space around her, so intimate during the dance, now felt exposed and treacherous. The Duke's protective presence was a shield, but it was also a beacon, drawing every ounce of the ton's venomous attention. She could not bear it, the weight of their collective gaze threatening to shatter the fragile composure she had so carefully maintained. With a murmured excuse, she extracted her hand from his arm and turned away, seeking an escape from the suffocating brilliance of the ballroom. She moved without a clear destination, her slippered feet carrying her through grand, empty corridors lined with somber portraits of long-dead aristocrats. The further she walked from the music and the crowd, the cooler and quieter the air became. A heavy oak door, slightly ajar, revealed a sanctuary. The library was a world apart, a cavern of silence and shadow after the sensory assault of the ball. The air smelled of old leather, beeswax, and the faint sweet scent of paper. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, painting silver stripes across the dark Persian rug and illuminating the endless rows of books that climbed toward the shadowy ceiling. Here, amidst the wisdom and follies of centuries, the petty dramas of the present moment felt insignificant. She walked to a shelf, running her fingers over the gilded spines, the touch a comforting anchor. She did not hear him enter, but she felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet disturbance in the library's profound peace. Turning, she saw the Duke of Blackhurst framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the hall. He stepped inside, closing the door with a soft but definitive click that sealed them in their private world. He did not approach her immediately, instead pausing to survey the room, his gaze appreciative as it swept over the towering bookshelves. The intensity that had marked their dance was gone, replaced by a calm, contemplative stillness. He moved to a different shelf, his movements unhurried, and selected a volume bound in dark green morocco. He held it with a familiarity that spoke of a man who was no stranger to libraries. He did not look at her as he spoke, his voice a low murmur that blended with the silence. He mentioned the author, a philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment, and a particular treatise on moral sentiment. It was not a comment designed to impress, but a simple, thoughtful observation, as if he were thinking aloud. Isidora felt a surprise that was entirely pleasant. She had expected gallantries, perhaps an inquiry about her abrupt departure, but this was different. This was an invitation to a meeting of minds, not a continuation of the ballroom's performance. She found her own voice, soft but steady, as she replied, agreeing with his assessment but offering a counterpoint from a French contemporary she favored. It was a risk to engage in intellectual debate, to reveal the workings of her mind, when most men only sought to assess her face or her history. The risk was met not with condescension, but with genuine interest. He turned toward her then, his expression illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, and she saw the keen intelligence in his eyes, the weariness with triviality replaced by a focused engagement. They drifted closer, not as a man and a woman in a potentially compromising situation, but as two scholars discovering a shared passion. They spoke of history and poetry, of the ideals of the ancients and the follies of the moderns. The conversation wove between them, effortless and deep, each comment building upon the last. He listened to her opinions, not as a novelty, but as valid and valuable contributions. In this quiet room, away from the prying eyes and whispering tongues, they were stripped of their titles and their scandals. He was simply a man of thought, and she was a woman of intellect. For Isidora, it was a revelation. For years, her mind had been a locked room, its contents deemed unworthy of display. Now someone was not only picking the lock, but admiring the treasures within. The connection forged on the dance floor was being tempered in the fire of shared ideas, becoming something stronger and more substantial. The Duke felt a similar sense of rightness. This was the genuine connection he had craved, the meeting of equals he had believed impossible to find. The woman before him was far more than the sum of her scandal. She was a complex, fascinating universe of thought and feeling. The library, with its thousands of silent stories, became the witness to the beginning of their own, a story not of scandal, but of a profound and unexpected meeting of souls. The arrival of Lady Penelope was heralded not by a fanfare of trumpets, but by a subtle yet perceptible shift in the very atmosphere of the soirée, a collective leaning in of the assembled ton, as if the entire room were a flower, turning its face toward a singular brilliant sun. She entered on the arm of a beaming Lord Huntington, a vision crafted from the very blueprint of aristocratic perfection. Her gown was of the palest blush silk, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with every graceful movement, a confection so exquisite it seemed to defy the mundane laws of fabric and thread. Her hair, a cascade of artfully arranged golden curls, was crowned with a delicate tiara of diamonds and pearls, a silent, glittering reminder of her royal blood. She was beauty itself, polished to a high, flawless sheen, and society adored her for it. Isidora, observing from her now customary position near a marble column, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard the whispers of Lady Penelope's arrival in London, of her suitability, her connections, her utter and unquestionable acceptability. Watching her now, Isidora understood the true meaning of despair, not as a sharp, sudden pain, but as a quiet, sinking certainty. This was the world's answer to a woman like her, not a flawed, thinking, feeling creature, but a perfect, empty vessel for title and tradition. Lady Penelope's laughter rang out, a sound like tiny, chiming bells, perfectly pitched and utterly devoid of true warmth. She moved through the crowd with the effortless assurance of one who has never been truly overlooked. Her every gesture a performance of charming innocence and vapid grace. The Duke of Blackhurst was, of course, steered toward her almost immediately by a determined dowager whose smile did not reach her calculating eyes. Isidora watched the introduction, her heart a dull, heavy weight in her chest. She saw the Duke execute a polite bow, saw Lady Penelope offer a practiced curtsy, her lashes fluttering demurely. They began to converse, and Isidora could imagine the exchange perfectly. Pleasantries about the weather, compliments on the assembly, the hollow, ritualized dance of high society courtship. She saw the eager, approving faces of the crowd surrounding them, the silent consensus that this was how things should be. The Duke and the Princess. It was a tableau of ideal union, a painting of propriety that left no room for a divorced woman with a sharp mind and a wounded past. But as she watched, her despair began to be tinged with a faint, flickering confusion. The Duke's posture, while impeccably correct, lacked any of the focused intensity she had witnessed in the library. His replies to Lady Penelope seemed courteous but distant, his smiles polite and impersonal. He was playing his part, but his soul was not in the performance. Isidora saw the exact moment his gaze, seemingly by chance, drifted away from the princess's perfect features and swept across the room. It did not wander aimlessly. It searched, and for a heartbeat it found her. The connection was fleeting, a mere brush of twilight eyes against her own, but in that instant the crowded ballroom vanished. He was not looking at a princess. He was looking for her. For Richard, the encounter with Lady Penelope was an exercise in profound superficiality. Her conversation was a stream of well-rehearsed observations and fashionable opinions, each word a polished pebble with no rough edges of original thought. She was like a beautifully illustrated book with blank pages inside. As she prattled on about a recent opera she had deemed delightful, without mentioning a single note of the music or a thread of the plot, his mind involuntarily contrasted her with the woman standing alone by the column. He recalled the weight and substance of Isidora's words in the library, the way her eyes lit with genuine passion when discussing a philosophical concept, the quiet courage in her stillness. Lady Penelope was society's masterpiece, but Isidora was a living, breathing landscape of depth and complexity, a stormy sea next to a placid, ornamental pond. He felt no spark, no flicker of interest in the perfect princess. Her beauty was a cold, static thing, a portrait to be admired from a distance. Isidora's beauty, however, was dynamic, etched by experience and intelligence, and it called to something fundamental within him. As he offered Lady Penelope a final empty compliment and extracted himself from the circle of her admirers, his decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. The Tun saw a princess worthy of a duke. He saw only a hollow echo of the real woman whose quiet strength had, in the space of a waltz and a conversation, irrevocably captured his attention. The introduction was over, the expected path laid out before him, but his gaze was already fixed on a different, far more compelling destination. The arrival of the bouquet the next morning was an event in itself, an intrusion of breathtaking beauty into the quiet, predictable rhythm of Isidora's modest household. The flowers were delivered not by a common errand boy, but by a footman in the distinct Blackhurst livery, a young man whose impassive demeanour could not conceal the significance of his mission. He held the arrangement as if it were a holy relic, a vast, loosely gathered sheaf of roses, unlike any Isidora had ever seen. They were not the blousy, cabbage-like blooms popular in London gardens, but something wilder, more exotic. Their petals were a deep, velvety crimson that bled into a soft, buttery gold at the base, each flower a captured sunset. The scent that filled the front parlour was not the cloying perfume of hothouse blossoms, but an intoxicating blend of spice and honey, a fragrance that spoke of warm earth and distant lands. Tucked amongst the thorny stems was a single, heavy sheet of vellum, folded crisply and sealed with a blob of dark wax impressed with a stylized hawk. Isidora's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The handwriting was bold and decisive, the ink a deep black. It contained no flowery declarations of admiration for her eyes or her grace, no empty phrases of courtly love. Instead, it spoke of her mind. The Duke's words were precise, acknowledging the pleasure of their conversation in the library, praising the acuity of her thoughts on the philosophers they had discussed. He wrote of the rarity of a genuine meeting of intellects, a sentiment that felt more intimate and more dangerous than any compliment to her person could have been. It was a gift not to the scandalous divorcee, but to the woman he had discovered behind the mask. The gesture was so profoundly different from the courtship she had known before. Her late husband's attentions had been performative, gifts given for show, words spoken to fulfill an expectation. Other suitors, in the brief period before her divorce had rendered her untouchable, had offered trinkets and vapid flattery. This was something else entirely. This was a recognition of her inner self, the part of her she valued most and which society had always deemed irrelevant. A warmth spread through her chest, a fragile, hopeful glow that was immediately chased by a chill of pure terror. Such a gift from a duke to a woman in her position was not merely kind. It was incendiary. It was a challenge flung directly into the face of the very society that had exiled her. The exquisite roses suddenly seemed less like a bouquet and more like a declaration of war, their beautiful, thorny stems a perfect symbol of the perilous attraction she felt. Her children's arrival broke the tense silence. Charles and Lily, drawn by the unfamiliar, glorious scent, tumbled into the room, their eyes wide with wonder. For them, the roses held no complicated meaning, no threat of scandal. They were simply a thing of breathtaking beauty. Lily reached a small, careful finger to touch a velvety petal, her face a picture of rapturous delight. Charles, ever practical, asked with great seriousness if the thorns were sharp enough to be used as weapons. Their innocent joy was a balm, pulling Isidora back from the precipice of fear. She gathered them close, inhaling the simple, clean scent of their hair, a counterpoint to the rose's intoxicating perfume. In their embrace, she found a fleeting moment of pure happiness, a reminder of the love that was real and unconditional, untouched by the cruel judgments of the world outside. She placed the bouquet in the center of the mantelpiece, where it dominated the room with its untamed splendor. All day, its presence was a constant, silent dialogue within her. One moment she would look at it and feel a surge of that forbidden warmth, a thrilling sense of being truly seen. The next, a cold dread would clutch at her heart as she imagined the gossip this would fuel, the fresh wave of hostility it would unleash. The roses were a gift, but they were also a choice. To accept them was to accept the Duke's interest and all the consequences that came with it. As twilight fell and the crimson and gold petals seemed to glow in the dimming light, Isidora knew that the thorns were not just on the stems. They were woven into the very fabric of this unexpected, dangerous, and deeply longed-for connection. The roses were a declaration, and the ton, that great ravenous beast of propriety, needed no translation. The news of the Duke of Blackhurst's extraordinary gift to the Granville woman spread through London's drawing rooms with the speed and virulence of a plague. It was whispered over needlework in stuffy parlours, debated with faux solemnity in the halls of whites, and dissected with vicious glee behind painted fans at every soirée. The bouquet was not merely a floral arrangement. It was a catalyst, transforming quiet condemnation into a roaring public spectacle. Isidora's name, once muttered in scandalized tones, was now spoken with a new, sharper edge, a blend of outrage, prurient curiosity, and naked fear. A duke's attention, once fixed, could legitimize the illegitimate, and the very foundations of their carefully ordered world seemed to tremble. The garden party at Lady Ashworth's estate was to be the season's premier outdoor event. A sprawling affair on manicured lawns, dotted with striped marquees and fragrant rose arbors. For Isidora, it was a trial by sunlight. She had considered refusing the invitation, but to hide would be to admit defeat, to confirm the shame they wished to heap upon her. So she went, her sapphire gown a defiant splash of colour amidst the sea of pale muslins and florals. The hostility was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was a physical force. Ladies gathered in tight knots turned their backs as she passed, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Their silence was a wall, their averted gazes a collective slap. A path cleared before her not out of respect, but out of a superstitious desire to avoid contamination. She found a vacant bench near a bubbling fountain, its cheerful sound a cruel mockery of the tension coiling in her chest. She tried to focus on the beauty of the surroundings, the vibrant flower beds, the ancient oaks casting dappled shade, but the weight of 100 staring eyes made it impossible. She felt like a specimen pinned to a board, her every breath, every slight adjustment of her posture, subject to intense and merciless scrutiny. A group of young matrons, emboldened by champagne and collective judgment, drifted close enough for their hissed words to carry. "The audacity," one sneered, not bothering to lower her voice. "To think a situation could be overlooked for a handful of flowers." Another laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "His Grace will come to his senses. A momentary fascination with something tarnished. It never lasts." The words struck with the force of physical blows, each one landing on a fresh bruise. Isidora's composure, her carefully maintained fortress, began to crumble under the assault. She looked down at her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, the world blurring at the edges as she fought to maintain her dignity. It was in this moment of near desolation that a shadow fell across her, blocking the harsh afternoon sun. She looked up, expecting another cutting remark, and found herself staring into the stern, unyielding face of the Duke of Blackhurst. He had arrived unnoticed, a silent, imposing figure whose presence alone commanded the attention of the entire garden. The whispers died instantly, replaced by a breathless, waiting silence. He did not look at Isidora first, but swept his gaze slowly, deliberately, over the crowd of gawking faces, his expression one of cold, aristocratic contempt. When he finally spoke, his voice was not raised, yet it carried with the clarity of a bell, ringing across the lawn and striking a death knell for the afternoon's petty cruelties. He spoke not to Isidora, but to the assembly at large, his words measured and sharp as shards of ice. He did not mention the gossip directly. He did not need to. Instead, he spoke of courage, of the strength required to face adversity with grace. He spoke of character, contrasting the shallow judgments based on circumstance with the profound value of intelligence and integrity. His voice dripped with scorn as he referenced the hypocrisy of a society that celebrated virtue while practicing viciousness, that worshipped honor while engaging in character assassination. He was not defending her. He was indicting them. Each word was a carefully aimed stone, shattering the fragile glass houses of their self-righteousness. Then, and only then, did he turn to Isidora. He offered her his arm, his gesture one of absolute, unshakable allegiance. The act was more powerful than any poetic declaration. In front of the entire ton, the Duke of Blackhurst was not merely acknowledging the scandalous Mrs. Granville. He was aligning himself with her publicly and irrevocably. As she rose on trembling legs and placed her hand on his sleeve, the silent garden seemed to erupt in a collective, unheard gasp. The walk they took then, away from the fountain and through the stunned, parting crowd, was a procession of defiance. The whispers had sought to destroy her, but the Duke's actions had transformed them into a meaningless buzz, the irritating hum of insects against the solid, unassailable wall of his protection. His defense had not just challenged the crowd's hypocrisy, it had shattered it, and in doing so had solidified a bond that gossip could no longer touch. The world had shrunk to the quiet confines of the Duke's townhouse library, a world away from the hostile stares of Lady Ashworth's garden. Here the air was still and warm, scented with leather and the faint, clean aroma of burning oak. Sunlight, softened by the tall, leaded windows, fell in rich golden pools upon the rug, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny sprites. The memory of the public confrontation was a fading echo, its sharp edges smoothed by the profound peace of this sanctuary. Isidora sat in a deep armchair, her hands resting calmly in her lap, though a faint tremor of residual tension still hummed beneath her skin. The Duke stood before the marble fireplace, his profile etched against the dark wood of the mantel, a figure of solid, unwavering certainty. He turned to her, his movements deliberate, his expression thoughtful rather than intense. He did not speak of the garden party or the whispers. Those things belonged to the vulgar world outside. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat and withdrew a small object that caught the firelight with a deep green glow. He held it in his palm for a moment, his gaze fixed upon it, as if seeing not just the object, but the centuries it represented. Then he stepped forward and knelt on one knee before her chair. Not in a gesture of courtship, but of earnest presentation. The ring was a heavy band of dark, aged gold, its centerpiece a single square-cut emerald of remarkable size and clarity. The stone was not a bright, flashy green, but the deep, mysterious hue of a forest pool, holding light within its depths as if guarding a secret. It was flanked by two smaller, brilliant-cut diamonds, their sparkle a stark, pure contrast to the emerald's somber richness. This was no bauble purchased for a season's fancy. It was a piece of history, weighty with legacy. He placed it gently in her hand, his fingers brushing against her palm, a touch that sent a current of warmth up her arm. He began to speak, his voice a low, resonant murmur that fit perfectly with the room's quiet dignity. He told her of the ring's origin, of a Blackhurst ancestor who had fought in the Crusades and brought the stone back from the Holy Land, a talisman of survival and faith. He spoke of the generations of duchesses who had worn it, women who had managed vast estates, raised families, and weathered wars and political turmoil. The ring was a symbol of endurance, of a lineage built not just on title, but on resilience and the quiet, steadfast work of building a life that mattered. It was not a symbol of mere power or wealth, but of continuity, of love that had, in its own way, persisted through time. Isidora listened, her eyes fixed on the emerald burning in her hand. She felt the weight of it, both physical and symbolic. This was not a gift like the roses, which had been a beautiful, if dangerous, compliment. This was an invitation into the very heart of his identity, an offering of his past and a question about his future. He was sharing his legacy, the bedrock of who he was, and in doing so, he was asking her to consider becoming a part of it. He spoke of his own weariness with the empty expectations of his station, his desire for a union that was a true partnership of minds and spirits, a legacy built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Not social convenience. Tears pricked at the corners of Isidora's eyes. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of being understood. He saw her not as a project for redemption or a rebellion against society, but as an equal partner in the creation of something meaningful. Her own past, with its pain and public failure, seemed to shrink in the face of this generous vision. He was offering her a chance to help write a new chapter in this long history, to add her own story of resilience to the ring's narrative. As his words faded into the comfortable silence, the emerald seemed to pulse with a soft inner light, a silent testament to the enduring power of love chosen, not imposed. In the quiet library, with the weight of his family's history in her hand, the emotional bond between them deepened into something unbreakable, a silent vow, spoken not with words, but with the profound language of shared hope and a legacy offered. The fragile peace, forged in the library's quiet warmth, proved to be as transient as sunlight on a winter's afternoon. The public defiance in Lady Ashworth's garden, meant as a shield, had instead poured oil upon the smouldering embers of society's outrage. A new, more vicious rumor began to circulate, not as a whisper this time, but as a shouted accusation that echoed through the ballrooms and coffee-houses of London. It was a tale crafted with malicious ingenuity, suggesting that Isidora's dignified resilience was nothing but a carefully calculated performance. The story went that she, the cunning divorcee, had set her sights on the Duke from the beginning, using her children as pawns and her learned conversation as a lure in a sophisticated scheme to entrap him into marriage and restore her ruined status. This particular poison first reached Isidora through a seemingly kind note from a distant acquaintance, a note whose commiserating words were laced with the toxin of the gossip itself. The paper fluttered from Isidora's numb fingers to the carpet, the elegant script blurring before her eyes. This was different from the general scorn she had endured. This was a targeted attack on her character, painting her as a manipulative adventuress, reducing the genuine, frightening connection she felt with Richard to a sordid plot. The walls of her carefully constructed composure, which had withstood so much, felt as if they were cracking under the weight of this new, specific calumny. A cold dread, deeper than any she had known, settled in her stomach. If the Duke were to believe even a fraction of this lie, the fragile trust between them would be shattered beyond repair. The thought of facing society again, of enduring the knowing looks and the hissed accusations, became unbearable. A profound weariness washed over her, a desire to retreat from the battlefield altogether. Perhaps, she thought, staring out her window at the bustling, judgmental street, the kindest thing for everyone, for Richard, for her children, even for herself, would be to withdraw. She could retire to the small country cottage left to her by a forgotten aunt, a place of quiet obscurity where her name would mean nothing. It would be a life of limited horizons, but it would be a life free from this relentless scrutiny. The emerald ring, hidden away in its velvet box, seemed to glow with a mocking light, a symbol of a future that was too beautiful and therefore too dangerous to grasp. Meanwhile, the Duke of Blackhurst received the news not through a genteel note, but through the blunt, unvarnished report of his most trusted valet, a man whose network of informants was the envy of the Foreign Office. Richard listened, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. The specific details of the rumor, the accusation of a trap, the manipulation of his affections, ignited a cold, focused fury within him. This was not the idle gossip of bored aristocrats. This was a deliberate character assassination, a weapon designed to wound Isidora and to test his own resolve. He knew the ton well enough to understand that such a precise and venomous story did not generate spontaneously. It had a source, a single mouth from which the poison had first dripped. His investigation was swift and ruthless. Leveraging his rank and his formidable presence, he cornered a known gossip-monger at his club, isolating the man with a look that promised consequences far more severe than social embarrassment. Under the Duke's unblinking gaze, the man's bravado crumbled, and a name was reluctantly surrendered: Lady Beatrice Croftwell, a dowager with a long-standing, petty grudge against Isidora's family and a pathological hatred for any disruption of the social order she held dear. Richard did not confront her at a crowded event. He arrived unannounced at her home, a sudden storm in her meticulously ordered drawing room. He did not raise his voice. His quiet, controlled tone was far more terrifying. He laid out the rumor before her, his words precise and sharp as surgical blades, and watched as her face, initially smug, paled with panic. He spoke not of his own feelings, but of the cruelty of attacking a woman who had already suffered greatly. He revealed his disdain, not just for the lie, but for the cowardice of attacking from the shadows. He made it abundantly clear that his allegiance to Isidora was absolute, and that any further attacks would be considered a direct affront to him, an act with tangible and severe repercussions. He left her trembling not with a shouted threat, but with the chilling certainty of his protection, a force as immovable as the foundations of his own title. The source of the scandal had been confronted, and in doing so, the Duke had unleashed a warning of his own. The soirée at Huntington House was the culmination of the season, an event of such opulence that it seemed designed to blind its guests to the petty machinations unfolding within its walls. Crystal chandeliers blazed, their light splintering into 1,000 rainbows by the prisms of countless jewels. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, hothouse blooms, and the cloying sweetness of ambition. Every titled personage in London glided through the grand salons, their laughter a carefully modulated music, their smiles masks of polished civility. It was a stage set for a predictable drama, the final public courtship of the Duke of Blackhurst and the impeccable Lady Penelope. Society held its breath, waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of a familiar play. Isidora stood near a floor-to-ceiling window, the cold glass a tangible reminder of the barrier between herself and the glittering throng. She wore a gown of deep amethyst silk, a color that spoke of royalty and resilience, but she felt like a ghost at the feast. The memory of the recent vicious rumors was a fresh wound, and though the Duke's defense had been formidable, the sting of the accusation lingered. She watched as Lady Penelope held court, a vision in ivory and silver, surrounded by a fawning circle of admirers. The princess glittered with a cold, flawless beauty, the perfect jewel for the Duke's crown. Isidora's presence here felt like an act of profound foolishness, a moth flying too close to a flame that would surely consume her. Then the Duke arrived. His entrance was not flamboyant, but it commanded an immediate hushed attention. He moved through the crowd with the innate authority of his station, acknowledging greetings with a curt nod, his gaze scanning the room with a purpose that was palpable. All eyes tracked his progress, expecting him to move toward the sunlit center where Lady Penelope shone. The air tightened with anticipation, but Richard's path did not waver toward the princess. He walked with unwavering determination directly to the quiet figure by the window, to the woman the entire ton had collectively decided to ignore. The silence that fell was not merely an absence of sound. It was a vacuum sucking the air from the room. The musicians in the gallery faltered. The rustle of silk stilled. Every head turned, every eye widened in disbelief. He stopped before Isidora, and the world ceased to exist beyond the space they occupied. He did not offer a casual greeting. Instead, he took her hand, his grasp firm and sure, and raised it to his lips in a gesture that was both a salute and a pledge. The touch of his lips on her gloved knuckles was a brand, a public marking that shattered 100 unwritten laws. Then he turned, still holding her hand, to face the stunned assembly. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and clear, carrying to the farthest corners of the grand salon without needing to shout. He did not begin with pretty words about love or attraction. He began with a critique, a cool, incisive dissection of the society that stood gaping at him. He spoke of the hypocrisy of valuing bloodline over character, of reputation over integrity. He questioned the very foundations of their judgments, pointing out the moral rot that festered beneath the glittering surface of their perfect world. His words were not an angry rant, but a logical, devastating indictment, delivered with the dispassionate authority of a judge passing sentence. He spoke of courage found in the face of adversity, of a strength forged in fires they themselves had lit. As he spoke, Isidora stood beside him. The initial shock that had frozen her gave way to a surge of something powerful and profound. The fear did not vanish, but it was met and matched by a rising tide of pride and a fierce protective love for the man who was risking everything for her. She did not cower or try to shrink from the hundreds of staring eyes. She straightened her spine, her chin lifting, her amethyst gown seeming to deepen in color as if absorbing the light of the chandeliers. The inner strength that had been her private fortress for so long now shone forth, visible to all. It was in the calm set of her shoulders, the steady light in her eyes, the quiet dignity of her posture. She was no longer a victim awaiting judgment, but an equal partner in this act of rebellion. Her silence was more eloquent than any speech, her presence a living testament to the truth of his words. He concluded not with a challenge, but with a simple, declarative statement. He named his choice. It was not a request for approval or a subject for debate. It was a fact, as solid and unchangeable as the stones of his ancestral home. In choosing Isidora, he was rejecting the empty pageantry, the suffocating expectations, the entire meticulously constructed edifice of their world. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. When he finished, the silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of 100 hearts. Then he turned back to Isidora, his gaze softening, the public orator replaced by the private man. He offered his arm, and she took it, her hand resting lightly on the superfine wool of his sleeve. Together, they turned and walked through the paralyzed crowd, which parted before them like the Red Sea. They did not hurry. Their steps were measured and sure. They moved through the grand rooms and out into the entrance hall, leaving behind a stunned silence that would soon erupt into a chaos of scandalized whispers. But in that moment, as they passed through the great doors and into the cool night air, the whispers did not matter. The choice had been declared. The world had been told, and in the shining strength of the woman at his side, the Duke of Blackhurst had found not a scandal, but a queen. The echoing silence of Blackhurst House after the roaring scandal of the soiree was a palpable weight. The grand mansion, usually a bastion of quiet authority, seemed to be holding its breath, its opulent rooms feeling more like a gilded prison than a home. Richard had expected the backlash from the ton. He had courted it, welcomed it as the necessary price of his freedom. But the opposition that struck deepest did not come from the ballrooms of strangers. It came from within, from the portraits lining the walls, whose painted eyes seemed to narrow in silent accusation, and from the living, breathing embodiments of the legacy he was perceived to be betraying. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived the next morning without announcement, a silent, black-clad tempest sweeping into his study. She was a small woman, but her presence filled the room, her spine as rigid as the principles she championed. She did not sit, choosing instead to stand before the cold fireplace, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles shone white. Her face, still handsome in its severe way, was a mask of pained disappointment. She spoke not with the hysterics of a society matron, but with the cold, cutting precision of a general surveying a battlefield lost to foolishness. She laid out the arguments like weapons on a table: duty, lineage, the sanctity of a title that was not his to squander on personal whim. She spoke of Lady Penelope not as a woman, but as a symbol of purity, of acceptability, of a future unsullied by gossip. Choosing Isidora, she stated with finality, was not an act of love. It was an act of selfishness that would tarnish the Blackhurst name for generations. His uncle, Viscount Hemsworth, arrived soon after, a blustering contrast to his mother's icy control. He paced the Persian rug, his face florid, his voice booming with indignation. He spoke of practicalities, of alliances that would be severed, of political influence that would wane. "The world runs on certain agreements, Richard," he thundered. You cannot simply decide the rules do not apply to you. This infatuation, it is a madness. Think of the family. Think of your duty. Richard stood by the window, watching the traffic in the square below. He let the words wash over him. These arguments he had known by heart since boyhood. They were the same arguments that had dictated his education, his friendships, his entire life. They were the walls of the gilded cage he had inhabited for so long. But now, having tasted the open air, the cage felt smaller, more suffocating than ever. The memory of Isidora's hand in his, the quiet strength in her eyes as they faced the ton, was a shield against their barbs. He turned from the window, and the room fell silent. The fury on his uncle's face and the grim disappointment on his mother's were met with a calm that was more formidable than any shout. He did not defend his feelings. To do so would be to play their game, to argue on their terms. Instead, he spoke of a different kind of duty, a duty to truth, to integrity, to the pursuit of a life that held meaning beyond heraldry and debtors' ledgers. His voice was low but resonant, each word measured and firm. He spoke of the hollowness of a union based solely on status, a life sentence of polite conversation and mutual indifference. He painted a picture of the future they envisioned for him. A beautiful cold marriage, children raised by nannies, an existence of quiet desperation played out in a series of lavish, empty rooms. Then he spoke of the alternative. A partnership of minds, a home filled with genuine laughter and intellectual passion, a love that was a sanctuary, not a cage. He looked directly at his mother, his gaze unwavering. "You speak of the Blackhurst legacy as if it is only a title and land," he said. "But what is a legacy built on a foundation of misery? What honor is there in preserving a name at the cost of one's soul?" The argument that followed was not loud, but it was deep and profound, a clash of two irreconcilable worlds. They pressed him with every weapon in their arsenal: emotional blackmail, dire predictions, appeals to centuries of tradition. But Richard stood his ground, a rock against the tide of their expectations. He was no longer the dutiful son and nephew, obediently following a path laid out by others. He was a man who had found his own North Star, and no amount of pressure, no threat of disfavor or social exile could make him deny its guiding light. His commitment to Isidora was not a rejection of his family, but an affirmation of his own humanity, a declaration that personal happiness was not a frivolous distraction from duty, but the very essence of a life well lived. When his mother finally swept from the room, her silence more telling than any words, and his uncle followed, shaking his head in defeat, Richard was left alone. The house was quiet again, but the silence now was different. It was not the silence of judgment, but the peaceful, earned silence of a battle won. The air cleared not of opposition, but of doubt. The path ahead would be difficult, but it was his path, and he would walk it with the woman whose courage had given him the strength to choose it. The storm of family opposition had passed, leaving in its wake a profound and clarifying calm. The arguments, the threats, the weight of centuries of expectation had been met and weathered. Now, standing in the secluded walled garden of a trusted friend's estate, Richard felt a stillness he had not known was possible. This was a world away from the gilded ballrooms and stuffy drawing rooms of London. Here the only sounds were the gentle hum of bees among the lavender and the soft rustle of leaves in the warm afternoon breeze. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of an ancient oak, dappled the flagstone path and illuminated the vibrant tapestry of roses, honeysuckle and jasmine that climbed the old brick walls. It was a place of peace, of secrets, a sanctuary meant for truths too profound for the public eye. Isidora stood before a bank of creamy white roses, her fingers lightly tracing the velvety petals. She seemed a part of the garden itself, her simple muslin gown a softer echo of the flowers, her presence a natural element in the harmonious scene. The tension that had held her shoulders rigid for weeks seemed to have melted away in this quiet space, replaced by a soft pensiveness. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a landscape after a storm, washed clean, serene, and deeply authentic. Richard watched her, his heart beating a steady, sure rhythm against his ribs. This was the moment. Every trial, every whispered cruelty, every familial ultimatum had led him here, to this certainty. He moved to stand beside her, the scent of roses and warm earth enveloping them. She turned to him, her eyes the color of a twilight sky, meeting his without hesitation. In their depths, he saw not the fear or defiance of recent weeks, but a quiet trust, a vulnerability that was more courageous than any shield. He took her hands in his, their warmth a tangible connection in the cool shade. He did not speak of the obstacles they had overcome or the battles yet to come. He spoke only of the truth that had become the center of his world. His voice was low, each word chosen with the care of a man laying down a sacred vow. He spoke of the emptiness of his life before her, a procession of days measured in duty and nights haunted by solitude. He confessed that he had believed himself destined for a life of quiet resignation, until a solitary figure in a sapphire gown had shown him what true strength looked like. He told her that her mind was the most captivating landscape he had ever explored, her spirit a fire that had warmed the cold corners of his soul. He spoke not as a duke to a disgraced lady, but as a man to the woman who had irrevocably claimed his heart. He laid bare his hopes for a future built not on society's shifting sands, but on the bedrock of mutual respect, intellectual companionship, and a love that had been tested and proven unbreakable. Then he released one of her hands and reached into his pocket. The small velvet box felt heavy with purpose. He opened it, and the deep green fire of the emerald ring caught the sunlight, blazing with a silent, ancient power. He held it out, not as a symbol of his wealth or title, but as a promise. It was an offering of his past, his present, and every future he dared to imagine. He asked her the simplest, most profound question, his gaze locked with hers, his entire being suspended in the silence that followed. For Isidora, the world narrowed to the man before her and the brilliant gem that represented a lifetime of choices. The ghosts of past failures and the echoes of society's scorn rose up, but they were faint, distant whispers compared to the solid, loving reality of Richard's presence. In his eyes, she saw not a rescuer but a partner. He was not offering to erase her past, but to build a new future with her. The fears that had clung to her for so long, of not being enough, of being a burden, of inviting fresh disaster, melted away like morning mist under the steady warmth of his love. A joy so pure and overwhelming, it felt like a physical force surged through her, bringing with it a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long and arduous journey. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was a tear of triumph, not sorrow. She did not need to search for words. The answer was in her heart, a truth as undeniable as the sun overhead. She placed her hand in his once more, her smile a radiant dawn breaking through the last of the shadows. Her acceptance was a silent, powerful force, a surrender that was in fact a victory. It was the triumph of heart over hypocrisy, of genuine connection over empty convention. As he slipped the heavy, cool band onto her finger, the weight of it felt not like a burden, but like an anchor, securing her to a destiny she had never dared to dream possible. In the secluded garden, surrounded by the scent of blooming roses, a scandal was finally, irrevocably, transformed into a promise. The morning of their wedding dawned not with the blare of society's fanfares, but with the gentle pearly light of a day determined to be soft and kind. There was no grand procession of carriages clogging the streets, no hordes of onlookers gathered to scrutinize the bride's gown or tally the worth of the guest list. The ceremony was held in the small ancient chapel on the Blackhurst country estate, a place of simple stone and quiet faith, far from the judgmental glare of London. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass window above the altar, painting the worn flagstones in pools of ruby, sapphire, and gold. The air was cool, and carried the faint, clean scent of beeswax and old hymnals. Isidora stood before the simple oak altar, her hand resting on Richard's arm. She wore a gown of cream-coloured silk, unadorned by lace or jewels, its elegance lying in the purity of its line and the quiet confidence of the woman who wore it. A small bouquet of wildflowers and herbs gathered from the estate's meadows replaced the hothouse exotic society would have expected. Its simple, earthy fragrance was a testament to the authenticity of the day. The only splash of grandeur was the emerald ring on her finger, its deep green fire a silent, steady promise of the legacy they were choosing to build together. The guests were few, a carefully chosen handful whose presence was a balm rather than a performance. Isidora's children, Charles and Lily, stood close by, their faces solemn with the importance of the occasion, yet lit with a happiness that needed no words. A trusted friend served as witness. There were no distant titled relatives present to offer cold congratulations, no society matrons to exchange knowing glances. The emptiness of the pews was not a mark of shame, but a declaration of freedom. This union was not for their approval. It was for the two souls standing at the altar, bathed in the multicolored light. The vicar's voice was a gentle murmur, the ancient words of the ceremony feeling new and profound in the intimate space. They spoke their vows not as a duke and a divorcee, but as Richard and Isidora. His voice was firm and clear, each word a vow etched in stone. Hers was softer but no less certain, a steady stream of commitment that washed away the last remnants of past pain. When he placed a plain gold band beside the emerald on her finger, the metal was warm from his touch, a simple, perfect circle to symbolize a love with no beginning and no end. Their hands remained clasped, a bridge of flesh and bone and promise, as the final blessing was spoken. Afterward, they did not host a lavish breakfast for hundreds. The celebration was a quiet meal in the sun-drenched morning room of the manor house, with windows thrown open to the sounds of the countryside. The table was laden with simple, hearty food from the estate's own lands. Laughter, genuine and unforced, echoed in the room. Charles, emboldened by the joy of the day, declared the wedding cake the finest thing he had ever tasted. Lily carefully saved the petals from her mother's bouquet, pressing them between the pages of a book as a treasure. The warmth in the room was palpable, a physical emanation of the love that filled it, a stark and beautiful contrast to the cold. Glittering spectacles that passed for society weddings. As twilight began to soften the edges of the world, Isidora and Richard walked together in the garden. The scent of the roses they had planted together weeks earlier hung heavy in the cool air. There were no words needed. The silence between them was rich and full, a shared understanding that needed no articulation. The distant, gentle peal of the chapel bell, rung by the vicar in a final private blessing, drifted across the lawns. It was not a clamorous announcement to the world, but a soft, resonant note that seemed to settle over the estate like a benediction. It was the sound of a new beginning, forged not in the fires of society's approval, but in the quiet, enduring warmth of two hearts that had finally, against all odds, found their way home. The quiet rhythm of life at the Blackhurst country estate was a balm to the soul, a world away from the cacophonous judgment of London. Mornings began not with the dread of social scrutiny, but with the gentle light of the sun spilling across the rolling lawns and the cheerful clamour of children's voices. The grand manor, once a monument to cold tradition, was slowly being transformed into a home, its vast, silent rooms now filled with the evidence of a shared life. A forgotten toy soldier stood guard on a windowsill in the library. A book of fairy tales lay open on a sofa in the drawing room, and a faint, sweet scent of baking bread often drifted from the kitchens. It was a domestic harmony so profound, it felt like a secret rebellion. Isidora moved through these days with a sense of peace that was still novel, a delicate bud slowly unfurling in the warmth of safety. She no longer braced herself for an insult when she walked into a room or measured every word before she spoke. In the quiet of the estate, she could simply be. She found immense joy in the simple routines of their life, overseeing the household with a quiet efficiency that earned the staff's respect, walking with Richard through the gardens as he pointed out plans for a new orchard, and spending long afternoons reading to Charles and Lily in the shade of the great oak on the lawn. Her children blossomed in the open air and the atmosphere of unconditional acceptance, their laughter a constant, healing music echoing through the halls. Richard watched this transformation with a deep, abiding satisfaction. The weariness that had been his constant companion in London had lifted, replaced by a contentment he had never thought to find. He delighted in the small, messy realities of family life, the muddy footprints in the hallway after a rainstorm, the earnest questions from Charles about estate management, the way Lily would climb onto his lap with a picture book. This was the legacy he had chosen, not one of cold portraiture and silent halls, but one of lived-in warmth and connection. His love for Isidora deepened each day, rooted not in the drama of defiance, but in the quiet soil of shared mornings, quiet conversations by the fire and the simple, profound comfort of her presence beside him in the vastness of their bed. Yet, the world beyond their gates had not forgotten them. The skepticism of the ton was a low, persistent hum, carried in the infrequent but pointed letters that arrived from London. A carefully worded note from a former acquaintance would express a hope that he was well settled, the phrase dripping with condescending pity. A society paper left by a visitor would contain a veiled mention of unconventional unions and the importance of preserving social standards. Isidora would sometimes find Richard standing at his study window, a crumpled letter in his hand, his jaw tight. The barbs still had the power to sting, a reminder that their happiness was, in the eyes of many, a transgression. But now they faced it together. Where once Isidora would have withdrawn, fearing she was the source of his trouble, she now stood by his side, her calm a steadying force. She would enter the study, place a hand on his arm, and say nothing. Her touch was a silent reminder of what they had built, a reality far more substantial than the paper-thin judgments of others. He would exhale, the tension leaving his shoulders, and toss the letter into the fire, watching the malicious words curl into black ash. The flames that consumed the gossip seemed to burn away the last of his doubt. Her solace was his strength, and his unwavering support was her armor. Their true partnership was most evident in the evenings. After the children were tucked in bed, stories read, and prayers whispered, they would retreat to the library. It had become their sanctuary, the place where their bond had first deepened. They would talk of everything and nothing, the children's progress, a book they were both reading, the management of the estate. There was no performance, no need to be the scandalous couple or the defiant duke. They were simply a man and a woman, finding redemption not in the eyes of society, but in the quiet, steadfast certainty of each other. The emerald ring on Isidora's finger caught the firelight, no longer a symbol of a challenge to the world, but a quiet testament to the peace they had forged within its walls. In the heart of the English countryside, a new beginning was taking root, nurtured by love and proven, day by quiet day, to be unshakable. The years had passed not as a slow march, but as a gentle, flowing river, carrying them from the turbulent rapids of their early union to the deep, placid waters of a life fully shared. The emerald on Isidora's finger, once a bold declaration, had become as natural a part of her as the laugh lines that now fanned from the corners of her eyes, each one a tiny monument to a moment of joy. They stood together on the terrace of their country home, watching as the sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and violet, the same colors that had blazed on the day of their small, perfect wedding. The air was soft, carrying the distant, happy shouts of their grown children playing a game of croquet on the lawn below. Charles, now a young man of steady character, was patiently advising his sister Lily, whose vibrant spirit had only been strengthened by a childhood filled with love and acceptance. There was no need for words between them. The silence was a comfortable old cloak, woven from threads of shared memory and profound understanding. Richard's hand found hers, his fingers, now slightly gnarled with age, interlacing with her own with a familiar, grounding pressure. His gaze, still as sharp and intelligent as the day he had first seen her across the Almack's ballroom, swept over the scene, the home they had built, the family they had nurtured, the enduring peace they had carved out of chaos. The legacy they had created was not one of titles or land, though those remained, but something far more precious. It was a legacy of resilience, a living testament that love, when chosen with courage and nurtured with steadfastness, could indeed conquer the most entrenched societal shame. Their story, once a whispered scandal, had become a quiet legend of its own, a private truth that rendered the opinions of the outside world utterly irrelevant. Later, as the stars began to prick the darkening velvet of the sky, the sound of a violin drifted from the open doors of the drawing room. Lily, with her mother's grace and her own fiery passion, had taken up the instrument. The melody she played was a waltz, sweet and hauntingly familiar. Richard turned to Isidora, a question in his eyes that had not changed in all their years together. She answered with a smile, and he led her onto the stone terrace, which was bathed in the soft silver light of a rising moon. There were no shocked whispers now, no hostile stares. They were alone, with only the night and the music as their witnesses. His hand settled at the small of her back, just as it had that first defiant night, and her hand rested on his shoulder. Their steps were slower now, a graceful, measured cadence that spoke of a deep and practiced harmony. They moved together in the moonlight, their shadows merging into one on the pale stone. The waltz was the same, yet entirely different. The rebellion had long since faded, its fire banked into the enduring warmth of a promise kept. This dance was not an act of defiance, but a celebration of continuity, a silent reaffirmation of the choice they had made a lifetime ago. As they turned slowly under the starlit sky, the music wrapping around them like a blessing, the enduring power of their love felt as tangible as the earth beneath their feet. An unshakable truth that would echo long after the final note had faded into the night.